Um, okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. We are going to have a discussion in honor of Latinx Heritage Month today. My name is Chanel Robinson. I am the wellness coordinator here at Nanotech and the co-chair of the DEI&B committee, along with Nicole, who is also here today. And we have a great video to share with all of you. It's 10 minutes, and we'll have our discussion afterwards. But I wanted to start today by sharing an experience that I had yesterday that's going to sound like it's not connected to this at all, but I swear it is. So I had jury duty yesterday, and I ended up on a jury for the first time. And I won't get you all into the details of everything, and it is done. It was just a one-day jury. But I had the experience of sitting on a jury and listening to a criminal case throughout the day with my fellow jurors, and then ending up in a deliberation room with five strangers. And we were tasked with having to come to a unanimous decision about this case based on the evidence. And in DEIB, in our committee, and the work that we do, and the work we do with all of you, we talk a lot about, I'm going to record before I forget. We talk a lot about, we are recording, difficult conversations and how to show up for difficult conversations and how to have really difficult conversations with each other and talk about hard things. And I think out in the world right now, I know out in the world right now, things feel very divisive to me. I could say that. And it feels like we have lost the ability to have a hard conversation with people that have differing values, have differing backgrounds. And in this room yesterday, I got to witness and be part of an experience where six strangers from completely different backgrounds, like completely different walks of life, came into the room, brought their own life experience, brought their own expertise. It wasn't perfect. People were interrupting, people were talking over each other, like it wasn't a perfect conversation, but we did it. And we came to a unanimous decision that everybody felt really good about. I think everybody felt like they were heard. People's minds were changed. Nobody went in people with like this feeling of like, this is my opinion and it will never change. There were people in the room whose opinions had changed by the end of the discussion. And I just felt so like a little bit of my faith in humanity had been restored a little bit by that conversation yesterday, by being in that room and by being with a group of strangers who were able to have a productive discussion about really hard things and come to a conclusion. And it was really cool, and it kind of really reminded me a lot of like our intention here for DEI&B at Nanotech, which has been to just keep showing up for these hard conversations, like even when we don't agree, even when we don't have the answers, even when we feel like a beginner, even when we're scared to speak up, even when we're scared to ask the questions, like that it really can be done. And I think us practicing it here also like let me have a little bit of confidence in that room yesterday and a little bit of like perspective. So I just wanted to start this conversation off with that, like that intention of continuing to do the work that we do, continuing to show up for these conversations and to listen to one another and to speak our truths and to speak our minds and to be beginners and to not have all the answers and to ask questions. And I think it's just like really important work to just keep having that practice. So I just wanted to share that with all of you today because it's been on my mind as we've been heading into this conversation. So yes, that was how I wanted to kick things off. So, but today we're talking about Latinx Heritage Month. We have a video, a PBS video for you all. We've been really finding some good PBS 10-minute, short videos that we can watch together and learn and go from there. So I'm not going to share too much about it. I'm just going to kind of kick it off as though we're all, seeing this for the first time together, which many of us are. I'm going to share my screen. And we can read the little description here. Jovita Idar helped organize the first Mexican-American Civil Rights Conference in 1911 to address racism, lynching, and dismal educational opportunities for Mexican children. So without further ado, we're going to watch this video all together. Please let me know if the sound or anything is off. and then we'll have our discussion.
She saw no conflict between being a journalist and an educator and a feminist. She was always on the front lines of change.
They say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
1914 Laredo, Texas. 29-year-old journalist Jovita Idar worked for the Spanish-language newspaper El Progreso when it published an editorial criticizing U.S. military intervention in the Mexican Revolution.
And for that, the Texas governor ordered the Texas Rangers to destroy El Progreso. They were a police force meant to protect the Anglo-Texan economic and political elites who would shoot first and ask questions later. But when they arrived, they found Jovita Idar standing proudly there, and she was not about to let them infringe upon their First Amendment rights as a free press.
The Rangers said, "Please step aside." And I said, "No, I'm standing here, and you cannot come in because it's against the law."
A Mexican-American, Spanish-speaking, bilingual brown woman stood up to the Texas Rangers at a time when they were committing terrible crimes against people of color, and specifically ethnic Mexicans.
Idar stood her ground, and the Rangers left. But as her brother, Aquilino, later described, they returned early the next morning.
They had hammers and sledgehammers, and they broke the press. They wrecked everything.
Jovita Idar was born in Laredo in 1885, 40 years after Texas became a state.
This territory that becomes the U.S. Southwest was actually part of Mexico. You have the U.S.-Mexico War in the 1840s, which Mexico loses, and they have to give up about half of their sovereign territory to the United States. Territory we now know as Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. So Texas, or Tejas, was part of that Spanish-Mexican world. But regardless of how long Mexican-American families had been in the United States, they were often seen as foreigners in their own land.
One of 8 children, Idar grew up in an educated middle-class family with a strong sense of social justice.
Her father was egalitarian in terms of women's rights. He believed that women had a right to have a political voice, and he was very proud of Jovita Idar, proud of all of her knowledge, all of her education, and her daring.
After attending Methodist schools, Idar became a teacher in 1903.
Ethnic Mexican children had no choice but to attend these schools that were second-rate in every way. The buildings were falling apart, they didn't have school supplies, and the history that they were learning taught them Mexicans were the bad guys, and Davy Crockett and other Anglo-Americans were the good guys. Jovita Idar quickly grew frustrated with the lack of resources and support.
Mexican children in Texas need an education. But if they are taught the biography of Washington but not Hidalgo, the exploits of Lincoln but not Juarez, that child will be indifferent to his heritage.
She believed that she would have better luck helping La Raza, Mexican-American and Mexican immigrant people elsewhere. And that's when she decided to join her father and her siblings in human and civil rights activism through journalism.
Idar became a reporter for the family's weekly Spanish-language newspaper, La Crónica.
She used the pseudonym in order to not be criticized for participating in what was considered to be unladylike critiques of the political culture in Texas at the time.
The focus of Jovita's reporting was racism, segregation, poverty, being bilingual, anti-Mexican hate, women, access to democratic institutions. It's like she could have been alive today. My name is Maria Hinojosa, and I'm the anchor and executive producer of Latino USA and of In the Thick. I was the first ever Latina hired at NPR in 1985 in the newsroom. Then I was the first Latina correspondent hired at CNN and at PBS. Right now, I'm one of the few Latinas running a nonprofit independent newsroom in the United States. The number of Latinas in America's newsrooms is still very small. Just over 2% in newspapers, about 4% in radio, and about 8% in television news. So journalism has been one of the slowest institutions to change and diversify and have real inclusion and equity.
In the early 20th century, we have essentially the creation of Jaime Crow or Juan Crow, which is the Mexican-American equivalent of Jim Crow. Signs that stated no Mexicans or dogs allowed were everywhere. Less known is the unfortunate reality that ethnic Mexican men were also lynched. Some people were burned alive, dragged across town. Really horrific ways of killing people, mutilating their bodies to intimidate ethnic Mexican people so that they would not vote, so that they would not complain.
In 1911, following the brutal lynching of a 14-year-old boy in Thorndale, Texas, Idar and her family organized a conference that kick-started the modern Mexican-American civil rights movement.
The first Mexicanist Congress, El Primer Congreso Mexicanista, lasted several days, and it was basically a human rights Congress that attracted leaders from the United States and Mexico who wanted an end to the discrimination and the lynchings.
Shortly after the Congress, Idar founded the League of Mexican Women and became its first president. The organization's main causes were women's suffrage and quality education for Tejano children.
We want our work to be significant, contributing to the formation of character and the cultivation of the minds of future generations.
She was in favor of women's rights to vote and to participate in the economy. One of the most significant roles that Jovita had was to invite ethnic Mexican women to participate. At a time when many Mexican American and Mexican immigrant women would have found it challenging to step into a public role, to be a part of the women's liberation process.
The Mexican Revolution began in 1910 and spread to Texas border regions by 1914. La Crónica ceased publication, and Idar joined a nursing unit for the Revolutionary Army.
La Cruz Blanca, the White Cross, founded by her best friend, Leonor Villegas de Magnon. And they're in the middle of battles trying to save men, bandaging up, sending them back into the battlefield, all in the name of bringing democracy to Mexico.
When the mutilated bodies of the soldiers were brought to my door, my heart jumped in volcanic upheaval. And from that moment, I felt that the fate and duties of my life had transformed.
After her service in the White Cross, Idar returned to journalism, writing for various Spanish-language newspapers and creating her own in 1916, titled Evolución.
I bought a press worth more than $1,000 and plenty of type. I can make a 7-column newspaper, and we'll start soon.
Her legacy is teaching us to be fearless. Being a Latina journalist in the United States of America means that the way you approach journalism is going to be different and distinct from other journalists. We actually have played a central role in the narrative of this country. We don't get a lot of play. We're not running the big newspapers of record, but our voices and our perspectives really matter.
Jovita Idar handed over the operation of Evolución to her brother Eduardo when she and her husband moved to San Antonio in 1921. There, Idar helped undocumented workers obtain naturalization papers after the Border Patrol was created in 1924. She also founded a free nursery school and tutored young children. She died in 1946 at age 60.
She used her voice to encourage women to be politically involved within the American system, to be proactive, to join organizations, to seek an education, to craft a better future for their children. And she devoted her entire life to that project.
Women recognized their rights, proudly raised their chins, and faced the struggle. The times of humiliation have passed. Women are no longer men's servants, but their equals, their partners.
Are we all back? We're back. Okay. Hi, everybody. Um, okay, so just to kick things off, I can start, but I would love to know, just start with something maybe new that you learned from this video, and then we can go kind of like see where the discussion takes us from there. And I can really kick us off. I will say that this was a person that I wasn't even familiar with before, which, we had a discussion a few months ago where I also got to learn about another amazing person in history that I had never even heard of. So I really, really like this just for that, to make sure that I am learning these names of these important people, these really, really impactful, important people that I have not gotten to hear of before. And this isn't really necessarily a new thing that I learned, but it was a really, really good reminder for me. And I hadn't thought of it in a way of from like the Mexican American perspective before, is that oftentimes when we're talking about these things, something comes up that reminds me of the way that I learned history. And they touched on that, right? Like learning the history, and for all these Mexican American children to not see themselves in that history when it's about them, So, and all the different, the different people that, we're learning about, Abraham Lincoln, but all these other people that we aren't learning about. So that was not something new that I learned, because I know that the way that history is taught is from, one perspective, and leaves out a lot of perspectives and a lot of people. But I hadn't necessarily thought of it in terms of like the Mexican American War and that period of time. So that's something that I would really like to go back and learn more about from different perspectives. So that is something new that I'm taking away today. So I would love to open up the conversation, something new that you learned, any general impressions that you might have. Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute.
Hey, everybody. Oh, go ahead, Carla. Okay.
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay.
Start us off.
If you beat me to it there. I just thought, like you said, to echo what you said, to learn about these figures in history who I did not know about is always so fascinating to me. And another thing that I learned in this video, we're talking about, to quell the violence, the Texas Rangers had implemented their own brand of lynch laws against Mexicans. And I never knew that. And then I think about the Texas Rangers baseball team, and like how how that almost like, thinking back to the origin of that name, maybe not the origin, but some of the incidents that occurred by the Texas Rangers, right? And then to have a baseball team named after that, I think is kind of interesting. And yeah, that was pretty much just one of the things that stood out to me, amongst others.
Carla.
So it actually warms my heart to just hear that we're learning about Jovita, because she actually is a huge influential person. And actually, I knew about her very briefly because it actually was a huge, historical figure that impacted my father's life and how he became into journalism and activism. And he started his first newspaper in New York called El Diario, which is just the journal. And all of what impacted him to start that and create it for the people by the people was really some of the vision that she had and continued to share throughout her life. So it's sort of a tidbit, but it continues to sort of impact just my frame of activism and thinking about our community. And I think Jovita was a great, person to share that about. So it's just good to hear.
Carla, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, at any point during this, if you anything else you want to share about her that wasn't necessarily in this today, I really want to learn more about her. So feel free to share all the knowledge you have. Nicole.
I just want to say I'm intrigued by how all of these discussions, it's kind of almost like coming full circle for people of color. So even to piggyback on what Tom said, because I didn't think about that, like the Texas Rangers. And then if you think about Native Americans and mascots for sports teams and just like people of color, period. So it doesn't matter if you're Mexican, you're Native American, you're African American, all of us have pretty much have the same experience. And I didn't know any of this information, you know what I mean? So it's good. And I'm glad that we have these things because now I want to go and dig deeper into this information, but it is all interconnected. So it's very interesting to me.
Yeah, the more we do this, you're right, Nicole, like the more connections like I'm able to, to make and to draw. And I think that that's really important. Like doing this work consistently over time, which is what we've been doing, has really allowed us to start to really see all these different connections, which is really great. And also so eye-opening to see, the things that we've learned along the way, how much we've missed and how we might have learned, or I can speak for myself, sorry. I might have learned about from one perspective, or like you said, the lynch laws, or I didn't know that there was like another version of like Jim Crow for Mexican Americans. Like I didn't know that. Those are new things to me, but it only expands this knowledge of like um both of the history and the whole picture, and that these things were not isolated to one group of people. I guess that's kind of like just like what you were saying, Nicole, like this treatment, the racism, the different laws that were put in place to really, really keep people down were not isolated to one group of people. It's been across. So I think the more that we can learn about that, the better. Yeah. Any other thoughts and reflections? Yeah.
I don't want to double dip before
Go for
anybody
it.
else wants to jump in, but kind of sparked what you said, sparked a thought of mine. So, um, it, you know, it wasn't just African Americans, right? The Mexicans, even like Jewish men living in the South in the early 1900s were getting lynched, for being Jewish. I had seen a play on Broadway called Parade with Ben Platt, and it told the story about Leo Frank. And this was a Jewish man who lived in New York, moved down south, ran a pencil factory. There was a death of this little girl in the factory, and they pinned it on the Jewish Yankee because he was living in the Midwest and they were all against, the industrialization in the North. And then they ended up charging him and for murder, and all this stuff happened, and he ended up getting lynched by a mob, And so to think that, you know, this is just, you know, um, distinct to one class, right? It's so unfortunate that, Mexican American, African Americans, Jewish Americans, it's just the intolerance for racial equality over the history of our nation is pretty disappointing. I'm glad that we're here today talking about, the past so we don't repeat those things, hopefully.
Can I just piggyback off of you, Thomas, as well? I think like a lot of it too is bravery for people who come forward and say that this isn't right. And I think along with that, they're able to build allies, and through the allyship, it's able to provoke change. So I think that's something that's good that's coming out of this committee, as well as like what the people have done in the past for history to make change as well. So I think in Nonotuck, just being able to do this is kind of shifting the culture of what we're doing through the committee. You know what I mean? And not saying that we're these people who are making that, but I think it starts somewhere in learning different cultures and experiences and be able to build allyship.
Yeah, I think we're the ripples in that stone that they threw into the water. That ripple effect is hopefully us, right? That can continue carrying on that message and spreading the good word.
Any other thoughts or reflections? I have some questions we can sink our teeth into.
I was just thinking, like, I do a lot of reading, and, we had the I think it was World War II camps with the Asian Americans, and as awful as that was, nowhere near as bad as this. And do you know what I mean? Like, it is interesting, and like, we haven't targeted necessarily the lighter skinned, unpopular ethnicities or religions like the Jewish people or Asian people as much as the black, people who are African American or darker skinned and so it's just interesting. Like I had no idea, I guess, because we're so far removed. I'm very northeast. I'm based here. I hadn't really, I've been to Mexico, but I guess I just hadn't really done a lot of reading on that subject, and it's just really eye-opening and sad.
Yeah, and Gretchen, that like really brings up for me that like I've been thinking about this a lot. Like who decides and how are we deciding what stories are being told, right? And like obviously when you're in school, and this touches on that because was part of the video, like really trying to make sure stories are being told in schools because that's where we're all beginning to hear these things, right? Like that there's representation. Um, But why is it that certain stories are told and certain stories as adults who are showing up to these like meetings, right? These events that we're having. So like we do have like a vested interest in this. Like we are trying and like maybe we can't commit as much, or I speak for myself, I can't commit as much time as maybe I want to, and I feel like I'm behind but like we're trying, right? So this is a group of people that is trying and we still don't know. So if you're not trying, if you're not actively seeking the information, you're definitely not getting it. And so like where are those, who's deciding that, where are those decisions being made, and why is it that certain stories are more accessible and then other stories of other cultures of our own American history, you really have to go digging, to get some answers or to get a different perspective than what we're taught. And I don't have an answer to that, but it is something that I have been reflecting on, like that, even with all the work we're doing, it it's sometimes hard to find the stories of certain people in our own history and to hear them from the perspectives that aren't always told. Um, and yeah, I think for me, I'm so grateful to this committee because once a month, like I have to seek them out and and work with my committee to be like, what story are we gonna tell? What are we gonna look at? Like, so I'm in a regular practice of doing that, and we are as a committee. So I'm very grateful for that. That I know we've talked about this too before, that those of us who are raising children or who have children in our lives, it is something that I do think about both with my daughters and son's school, but also like how am I supplementing what they're not getting. And that is something I think about regularly, like at least being aware of the stories that they are exposed to, and how can I supplement with different perspectives. And I think that is like a responsibility that I'm feeling as a parent. Gray, your hand up.
Yeah, well, I think when we think about why there's certain things that are taught and learned in like basic education or just discussion. I mean, I think it a lot of it just stems from systemic racism. I mean, as a whole, right? In terms of policies and practices and structures within institutions and societies that just kind of perpetuate the inequality and discrimination that are maybe not as uh, overtly racist on the surface, right? But when it comes to, um, like I said, what we're taught and what we're learned, I think it goes hand in hand with the unequal access to certain resources that specific marginalized groups have, or um, disparities in law enforcement and criminal justice, right, and healthcare inequalities, those kind of things, educational inequalities. I think it's just so embedded that it's something that it's just so it's like just part of society, and as unfortunate as it is that it takes us so long to question why we never learned about these things, we need to individually or collectively as small groups figure this out separate from those things, right? And like I said, I just think it's so embedded, and I know that's incredibly unfortunate, but I think that's a product of systemic racism.
Yeah, definitely. That was well said. Nicole.
I'd also like to say that you can't, if you don't know what you're looking for, then how are you going to learn about it, right? So I was never on the radar for this one. This woman was never on my radar. So that would be the last thing that I would be even looking for information on. And I think once we all kind of leave school, we don't have history class anymore. You know what I mean? So we're not as apt to be like, oh, well, let me try to find this. Unless you probably have a discussion about it, like you said, Janelle, and it's making you go and look for all these different things now to gain information. And then, like, in terms of going outside and teaching your children outside of what they're taught in the classroom, there could be backlash from that too. Because I remember having conversation with my daughter about Thanksgiving and the meaning when she was younger. And then she went to school and decides to open her mouth, and it was like, what are you talking about? Other students were even looking at her like she was crazy. And then it was like, all right, babe, look, some things you have to keep at home. That age group is not going to understand anything that you're talking about, so you do have to figure out a time when it is appropriate for you to have these discussions with young children, because children are very impressionable, and depending on what you're teaching in your home and what somebody else is teaching in their home, and then what people think about the school system, like, no, this is what's taught at school, this is what it is, and we're not going to deviate from the lessons that are being taught. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Nicole. One thing that really struck me and has continued to strike me as we've kind of like learned about different figures and is that, oh, and Gretchen, I'll come back to you. So if it's not related to this, don't worry. It's just like a thought, trying to let people gather their thoughts, and I'll share mine. Is that I like her ability to the way that she physically showed up, like people came to take down like the press and she like did not let them in, right? Or the way that she like physically showed up during the war, like for the White Cross, you know what I mean? And like the fact that like it was her I don't know, just these little stories, like that was her best friend's organization. So she was like with her best friend and they were like on the front lines, like healing people and then like sending them back out into the battlefield, like I I just am so struck every time by these activists that just show up in that way, and I guess as a female, like to see females doing that like is very striking to me and moving to me. um that's just another thing that I'm kind of like sitting with after that. I just like feeling very inspired by her in that way, that is in my life, especially like seeing these women like show up in that way is just very inspiring to me. And yeah, something I'm taking away that really struck me about her and the work that she did. Gretchen, did you want to share?
Sorry, I was just gonna add that the HR team recently went to a conference, and I knew this, but I brought it to the forefront of my mind, is that, our grandchildren are gonna see a very different United States, that the white Caucasian person is not going to be majority. They are gonna be a minority, and that will be a very interesting thing to see evolve, and I hope that it'll be good. I hope that it'll be, we'll be putting lots of different cultures and backgrounds and ethnicities in positions of power and influence, and we seem far more accepting, at least in the Northeast, of different sexualities. And it's my child grew up very differently than I did, and I grew up very differently from my parents. So hopefully, even though human nature is what human nature is, I'm hoping that, we are on a good path and that we are heading towards equality and openness. I just need to believe that.
Yeah, I think holding on to hope is essential. It's essential. And I think, Gretchen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we pulled some numbers, and I think Nonotuck is very much reflecting that tilt as well. We are now over 50% people of color at Nonotuck. So we are a reflection of that as well, where we have less Caucasians than we do people of color being represented of the people that work at Nonotuck for our employees. So that's pretty cool. So all the more reason to and also, and hoping to continue to see, like, we've seen a lot of people of color in our leadership positions, which is at Nonotuck as well. And so hoping to kind of see that grow and continue, and hope that, we are that mirror reflection, that you're talking about, Gretchen. So thanks for sharing that. Any other thoughts that anybody wants to share about the video or anything that we're discussing? So one of the themes of the video was the newspaper and journalism and all that. And Carla, now I'm going to put you on the spot because I'm so curious about your father's newspaper and all that. But I think it just also kind of got me thinking about journalism and where you're getting information, and same thing, like the representation that has to be in the media, and the sources that we're getting, and the opportunities to create newspapers that are sharing this perspective and this information, and how important that is. So it really isn't just in schools, but it's like thinking about everywhere that we're getting this information, and who we're getting it from, and making sure that there's representation in that. But Carla, do you want to share anything about the newspaper or anything? I think that's so cool.
It's funny because when I was much younger, I just thought, oh goodness, there's another thing I have to go with my dad to his office and figure out, just help him out and, figuring it out all the way through. But a lot of lessons that I learned there was question everything, listen, and research, right? Those three things were one of the main situations of why I was probably really difficult at home, because I asked so many questions to my parents, and just it was never no or a yes was sufficient for me. And I would use others around me to try to make, here's my point, make sure that this is here. And I just learned a lot from those experiences, and also just realizing that there's more than one side to any story, and there's always going to be stories that aren't shared and that aren't told. And there's so many people, even though they may not be on the newspaper, however, are so influential to us, right? There's so many people that are in our lives that they may not be in a newspaper, but their stories are so, amazing, and their trajectory, or however, is just passionate. It's ways that we sort of see lives, and however. But yeah, I mean, any other questions specifically about that? I mean, my father's connection to the community was we of course migrated here from the Dominican Republic, so a lot of his communication and structure is one, trying to find a job when he first got here, and then trying to find his passions and then move forward through that way. And eventually created the newspaper with friends and family to assist and then build that a part of his history. He was a cultural director in New York for the Dominican Republic, and had a lot of just news and different pieces of art that he would share and try to get connected to the rest of the community in New York. Um, and I was around a lot of that for most of my young adult life and helped in different events in different ways. Um, and there's, of course, pain and a lot of news, but then there's also good things to share. I mean, I always urge people to even think about what does Latinx mean to you, right? And researching that. Um, I know it's a very sort of divisive sometimes in our community and what that means and who uses it and how it's used or however. Asking questions, listening to people. Um, but, in the same breath, just thinking about there's good things to look at. How much food do I know that, could be shared during this month? There's so many different recipes of different cultures of however, a recipe that could be very close to heart for me in the Dominican Republic could look 100% different to someone who lives in Mexico, for example, but it's called different or has the same ingredients or however. It's just always good to see different pieces of people's culture and what's close to them. Um, and then just influential, people in our history. Just ask the questions, look them up, see if there's anybody in your community that's familiar. If not, research, be involved.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, I'm gonna take that away, like to keep asking questions. Thank you. Yes, really powerful to think in that way.
Can I ask you a
Um,
question, Carla? And I don't want to
yeah.
put you on the spot, so you don't have to answer. But this is something that has been plaguing my mind that you say the Latinx thing and how it's controversial. Can I ask your thoughts on that, Latinx or Hispanic Heritage Month? Which is it for you
Yeah,
and
great
why?
question.
So I think that you have to so for me, right, I can just say what may identify as, right? But in terms of the divisiveness of what it is, if you think of the word Latinx, it was really created in a Western standard of gender neutrality, right? And what that word, the X that's added there, when we speak Spanish, there's the A or the O that's either added for the feminine or masculine. So that's usually what that point would reference for. But there's a lot of folks, for example, in our community who only speak Spanish who have no idea what that is. Like, how do you even say Latinx, right? In my household, if I say Latinx in my house, people will look at me like, what does that even mean? Right? It's like culture and language moved without sort of involving other people. um, where someone can just say, well, it's so that we are inclusive and so that we include everybody in that. Whereas other folks, for example, my grandmother or my father or my mother would just tell me that makes no sense to me. Right. And as they learn and as we teach and as they understand, right, it's about just understanding some of those pieces. I know there's also another term, Latin with an E, that people have been using instead of the X. But then also as well, just realizing that our representative of Latin and Hispanic has always been divisive because of where people are from. I am from the Caribbean and I'm Dominican, but that does not mean that I'm from Brazil. That does not mean that I'm from Spain. That does not mean that somebody that's from Mexico, for example, is from all of those other areas. So it's tough to sort of put so many different cultures and ethnicities in one sort of grouping. We're all not going to agree, but I think that we've sort of come to an understanding that we have more in common than we don't. But I think for each his own, right, in terms of their representation. I might, be a Latina who's a part of the LGBTQIA community, who also is a person of color and also is an Afro-Latina in my own different ways and my roots and my culture, from indigenous people that are in our community. So I really just think it's It's about where you're from, how you grew up, how you'd like to identify. Ask people, just as we ask for anyone's gender pronouns if they have a specific situation. It's just about seeing what they're comfortable with.
Thanks, Carla, for sharing that, because we talk a lot about language on the DEI&B committee, and like both the power of language, are we using the right language? And we run into this a lot, Native American Heritage Month too. Um, really all of them where we are lumping so many different people into like one category. And all those people do identify differently in their own lives. Like we've talked before, Native American or Indigenous people, there's also so many tribes within that. And really, when it comes down to it, people are like, well, I really prefer to be called by my tribe, but you have to ask me that, to know. And I think I love your point about like talking to people and asking them how they want to be identified. And it's this kind of like double-edged sword where I feel like having these months, and figuring out what to call them, and we've talked about too, where it feels like, oh, like, we're just celebrating like one large group of people for 1 month and then we move on. But then at the same time, it sparks these conversations, and it's like, okay, where we say like we don't um know where to get the information, and we feel like there's so much missing, and at least like I know, okay, like this is the month, so this is my like point of research for this month at least, so like it's like, and I at least it gives me like this direction, and it gives us direction for this committee. But I totally like struggle with that a little bit, Carla, like you said, where it's like we're just like lumping these large groups of people together and then saying like this is the month, this is what we're calling it, which people didn't even ask the people whose month it is, right? Like how they're identifying. It's like this westernized view of it. Um, but then like the results of it, I'm feeling like are really good because we're having these conversations and stuff. But I think I feel that a little bit, that kind of like bumbling through the language a little bit and figuring out the best ways to the best language to use. And so I just appreciate that we're having these continuing conversations about it, and that it's not perfect, and that always coming back to the reminder about the individual and the person that you're talking with, or you're talking to, or you're talking, you're sharing about like how do they see themselves, and how do they identify, and how do they want to be called, and what does it mean to them, is really important. And Carla, I wanted to tell you too, and this is like, this group is going to get the first kind of like hint about this, but we are going to be launching a new project, kicking off with Latinx Heritage Month, with Hispanic Heritage Month, um, called Cooking with Love. And we are going to be having a place on Teams, like a channel similar like we did to the walking challenge, for people to share recipes. And our vision is that we're going to be sharing recipes that go with, the cultures and the communities that we're celebrating that month. But also, we just want people to share. And we also want people to like take pictures of themselves at home cooking the recipes, post it back, like have this feedback loop. We want to have recipes that feel accessible enough that caregivers and people we serve can be doing these recipes and then taking pictures and then sharing them back with our community. So you're right on there, Carla. Like that's coming out very shortly. We have some things in place, and we're going to be launching it. We're going to be launching a whole channel, Cooking with Love. And our hope is, really to be sharing those foods and that celebration, and to kind of see that like another way of seeing like cross cultural, both like uniqueness and differences, but also like the shared connections, and just getting that like exposure and celebration that way. So it's coming. We're so excited about it. But yeah, and so please share recipes on there. We'd love to see them and to try them. Okay, we have about 8 more minutes. Is there anything else anyone would like to share before we close? All right, so before we end, I just would love to kind of bring you all back to my kind of thought and intention in the beginning of these conversations that we're having, because I think this is just like another beautiful example of it, that I don't know, all these people from all these different backgrounds, like really can come together and have a respectful, imperfect, um, thoughtful conversation where we don't have all the answers, but we're just like learning from each other. And I just want to thank you all again for continuing to show up in that space, because I know it can be uncomfortable, it can be hard. Um, but it's like feels so important to me right now to continue to just like come together in this space, because I'm not, other than like that random jury deliberation room I was in yesterday, like I just am not seeing this as much, right? Where like people from all different backgrounds can come together and talk about hard things and leave feeling good and like we accomplished something. And so I'm leaving with that feeling today. I'm so grateful for you all for being here and for being part of this and for continuing to have these conversations and learning from one another. It's really special to me, and it feels so, so, so important. So thank you all again. And I hope you all have a really great day. And I'm gonna share that video to general, just for anybody that missed it and wasn't here today. And we'll share the recording of this discussion. I just think it was so powerful and so moving, and I want more people to know her name, because I feel so grateful that now I know who she was, and I have another strong woman in my life to be inspired by. So I can always have more of that. So thanks everybody. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.